and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump on the phone on Monday following a successful meeting between the two leaders in Busan. Both sides touched on key issues, including the Taiwan question. Chinese President Xi Jinping emphasized that Taiwan's return to China is an integral part of the post-war international order. Trump, on the other hand, responded that the United States understands how important the Taiwan question is to China. As the world's two largest economies and major international players, China-U.S. heads of state diplomacy could do well for global stability, many analysts believe. So what's the next after this top-level interaction? What do these diplomatic efforts mean for long-term China-U.S. relations? Let's loop in our panelists. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Saurabh Gupta, Senior Specialist from the Institute for China-American Studies. In Beijing, Zhao Hai, Director of the National Institute for Global Strategy. In Shanghai, Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney from East China Normal University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. The latest phone call between the two presidents of China and the United States certainly has led to a series of imagination as to the current stage of the U.S.-China relations and also this implication of this phone call. Mr. Zhao, with the public information that we have, how much can we tell?
Well, clearly this phone call happened at a very critical time. From the Chinese readouts, there's certainly three topics that's been talked about. First one is the optimism of the Busan summit, and the two leaders wanted to confirm that they will continue to push forward for a bilateral trade deal. And secondly, and most importantly, the two leaders definitely talked about the Taiwan issue and particularly Japan's new provocative speech by the new prime minister on this particular issue. The two sides also confirmed that they will both protect and maintain the post-World War II international world order. And thirdly, they are talking about other issues, in particular the Russian-Ukraine conflict, and try to cooperate on this issue and work together to end this conflict as soon as possible. But overall, my understanding is that this phone call is very much focused on the Japan issue, and hopefully the United States can work out, particularly the phone call between the U.S. president and Japanese prime minister happened right after. So I think that's the focal point.
Very interesting. Now, to you, Mr. Gupta, the U.S. readout have a different priorities and emphasis.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And if you notice in the readout, the word Taiwan was missing from the readout, the most important part of the conversation between the two presidents. I think it's important that Mr. Trump is showing a very cooperative attitude because he wants to get his trade agreements and his trade deals, which is his priority, done. And there is a very good window over the next 12 months to get that done. So what I saw in that readout was a degree of evasiveness from the U.S. in terms that it does understand the sensitivity of the matter, but it's not putting the Taiwan issue on the front burner. But at the same time that he wants the relationship to be consolidated, the U.S.-China relationship, so that the 4 visits that could potentially happen next year could happen, and that great things could happen on the commercial and trade side, and maybe even on the technology side of the U.S.-China relationship.
Very interesting. Professor Mahoney, now, in the readout, the U.S. one, the U.S. president suggested our relationship with China is extremely strong, end of quote. Of course, Mr. President of the United States sometimes tend to put a lot of color in his words of descriptions. Yet, what does that mean, this language at this moment?
Well, I think the central concern that some of us have is that the United States is playing what game theorists call a nested game. That what Trump is most concerned about this week is whether or not he's going to push through a peace deal in Ukraine. And I think Washington still harbors the idea that Beijing has the ability to pressure Moscow to reach a conclusion there. And we know that We haven't seen much positive responses yet from Russia on that proposal. At the same time, the United States has created a crisis in Venezuela, and so and at the same time, there's a suspicion that maybe the U.S. has encouraged Japan to take this provocative position vis-a-vis Taiwan, and all of this is to try to push China to incentivize China to take a stronger position with Russia, and that's really what's driving these developments this week. So when Trump says that he has a strong relationship with China, we understand that this is a bit of bluster, but he's also trying to assert that he does have the ability to bring China to the table on these other issues, even if he's touching directly or indirectly red lines like Taiwan.
Mr. Zhao, tell me, how do you see from the Chinese readout the emphasis of the Taiwan issuer question, and how is it being interpreted in the overall context of China's message to the rest of the world about Taiwan?
Well, I think that this is a very important point. At this point, the Taiwan issue related to Japan is no longer China's domestic issue or a regional security or peace, cross-strait peace issue. It's an international order issue because China has raised this issue to that level at the United Nations, claiming that China is the winner of the World War II. And out of that post-World War II order, there's a clear clause stipulating that Japan needs to remain as a demilitarized country without armed forces and has no right to fight a war. And therefore, the wrong message that's expressed by the Prime Minister of Japan is a violation, clear violation of the United Nations Charter. And also to say that we still don't know whether or not the U.S. encouraged that speech, but clearly that is also stepping out of the Japan-U.S. Security Pact. So overall, I think China is reminding the U.S. that the very dangerous words coming out of Japan is not only challenging the regional peace and stability, but also challenging the whole post-World War II international order. And at that point, also harming the U.S. Stance and position in the West Pacific, because if China and Japan enter into a conflict, the U.S. will be dragged into this conflict, and there's no good outcome for the U.S. Getting involved in this conflict if they're not intent to do so. And by the way, I don't think that if the U.S. wanted to launch this dispute or conflict between China and Japan in order to pressure China to help more on the Ukraine issue, that will definitely backfire, because China will not actually contribute to any sort of progress on that side if the U.S. is trying to challenge China on the Taiwan issue.
On the other hand, in the Chinese media reports, Chinese president was quoted earlier as saying that Taiwan's return to China is an integral part of the post-war international order.
Yes, of course, because it's very clear that from the Cairo Declaration to Potsdam, Taiwan after the war must be returned to China and has been, and the sovereignty has never been divided, even though there's a different political regime on Taiwan. So once, the unification process has nothing to do with Japan. So if Japan, as the Prime Minister claimed, Takaichi claimed that Japan has a right to intervene, then definitely China has defined that as an action of aggression. It's an invasion. And therefore, China has the right to defend itself. And not only that, because of the post-World War II United Nations structure and the regulation on Japan, China also has the right to strike Japan if China deems Japan as revitalizing its militarism and try to take more aggressive actions on Chinese territory.
What do you make of Chinese president's framing this time in the telephone call? Of course, earlier in many of the exchanges taking place in China with the rest of the world on so many different layers. Framing this in a historic context, and also calling on the United States, which China suggested has been fighting against the militarism and fascism during the Second World War together, to be aware of what is going on.
Well, I thought the framing was very interesting, because this is, from the Chinese side, the simple point is being made that this is an interference in the internal issue of China, but it has been framed in a way to suggest that this is also part of the post Second World War order. And I think that framing makes it that much more powerful. I think that there is a real question that needs to be asked of Japan, and to be frank, of the United States and the Western countries. But then the question to be asked of Japan specifically is that, when they reinterpreted their right to collective self-defense, they mentioned that they would exercise the right only when an armed attack happens against a foreign country. So is Taiwan a country or not? That is the question they need to answer. So I thought it's very useful at this point of time, particularly on this 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, that it is being framed in these terms. And it also kind of throws into view the question of the regional security architecture. So I think he was just alerting President Trump to the fact that China is not a revisionist power. It is operating by the rules-based order, and it is Japan which is trying to reopen issues, and that nobody should be reopening that issue. And this is a warning to not just to the United States, but to the Filipinos and to the Koreans, that this is not your contingency to participate in. This is an internal issue of China.
The question is how a statement by a Japanese prime minister, in fact, could harm the overall picture of China-U.S. relations if not handled well.
I think it's interesting to recall that back when we started seeing Taiwanese separatism really start to move forward with the elections of independence parties, we saw the United States pressuring those authorities in Taiwan to not press forward with independence, that it would be too disruptive of the status quo, and this would imperil the security architecture of the entire region. I think we see a similar situation now emerging in Japan. The question we have, of course, is the extent to which the United States has encouraged this, or the extent to which the United States will now be a responsible power and discourage this behavior. But to speak to some of the points that were being raised by Dr. Gupta, I think that the key reason that President Xi was reminding President Trump of this history is that a change in the status quo is also damaging to the United States. The status quo is what has allowed the United States to sustain its military presence in Japan. And while most countries in Asia aren't necessarily happy about that, they're also not very happy about the idea of Japan returning to a militarist position. Those American forces that are still basically the occupation forces from the end of World War II. But that sort of development needs to be taken in consultation with the countries that surround Japan, that were harmed most directly by Japan during that earlier period when militarism was the ideology driving Japanese aggression.
The U.S. president has been very proud in labeling himself as the president for peace. How is that title likely to be filled with contents? And how would that reflect it in the future interactions the U.S. president would have with China, for example?
My view with regard to Mr. Trump and Taiwan is, frankly, though, that he wishes the issue would just disappear. He does not want to be the president during whose term the status quo got disturbed. He has bigger and better things to do on the commercial side, and he will earn his peacemaking credentials elsewhere in the world where there is actual human bloodshed.
Mr. Zhao, there are analysts coming from all over the world reading different things out of the latest readouts and conversation between the two heads of states, China and the United States. It only provides us with more materials to dig in. But having said that, though, there are two different views. Seems quite obvious. One is that the U.S. could use this opportunity to have more leverage on China, so to speak, whether it is in its relationship with Japan or it is about the Taiwan issue/question. The other view is that this is a great testing stone for China to understand exactly what the Trump administration is standing in terms of a very crucial, fundamental question that China cares about at this stage of this bilateral relationship. What do you think, Mr. Zhao?
Well, I disagree with both. I think this situation is too dangerous to play games. Trump is really thinking on a transactional basis, and his interest in Taiwan is getting the TSMC back to the United States, and also force Taiwan, just like Japan and South Korea, to invest huge sum in the United States, and that's all he cares about. And in China, also he cares about the deal. Asking China to purchase more, invest more. He's thinking on economic or geo-economic basis, not geopolitics. Mm-hmm. And for the Chinese side, I think this is a very serious issue. It's about our national identity, national sovereignty, and territorial integrity. I think the testing theory is too shallow at this point. And mm-hmm. I think already China has raised this issue to an international post-World War II order level. And that means China sees this issue very seriously. And considering if going down this path, if China continues to push forward with our unification process, then Japan could involve in an armed conflict with China. And President Xi calling President Trump is trying to prevent that eventuality. And I think if President Trump is clear about the situation, right, he should be playing a role and calling Japan to restrain and change its position on this particular issue.
Mr. Gregory Mahoney, please, Professor. How is different sides try to use this opportunity to interact? What do you think?
I take a little bit different view. I think, we did see Trump retreating recently on the trade war and basically a ceasefire and pullback for a year. This will allow the Americans to get through the Christmas shopping season that starts in a couple of days. It would take some of the pressure ostensibly off American farmers who've been hard hit by the tariff war. And all of this would lead into creating more favorable tailwinds for Republicans ahead of the midterm election. So we've got this 1 year that takes us to November, this 1 year sort of ceasefire on the trade war. So I do think that it is imperative for Trump not to lose ground on creating some calm economically so the Republicans aren't gutted in the elections next year. And so this is something that he has to pay attention to. But I do think that there is a broader strategic game being played here. And I do think that it is very dangerous. And I do think that Washington is fully aware of the game that they're playing.
Let's go to another very important point about relation between China and the United States. Both readouts mentioned, which is about following up on the important meeting at the Busan airport by the two presidents. And it seems that both sides have been suggesting positive words, either in their readouts or in their spokespersons' interactions later with the media about this point. Mr. Gupta.
I think there's excellent progress happening with regard to the consensus at Busan. The one area which still is being worked on is with regard to how China goes about doing the implementation and licensing on the rare earths and critical minerals front, because that is a process where China is rolling out. Rolling out means it's in a process of implementing on paper those controls so that it has a better idea of end users, not with the idea to hold back, because I mean, for the Americans in particular, these rare earths are going to flow and flow abundantly, but there is paperwork to be done and how that process is handled. And that takes time because China is fairly new at going about trying to draw up this process in being able to, if it ever wants to implement these export controls at a later point of time. So that process is still being discussed, but I think Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, just spoke on this 2 or 3 days back, and he expects that process to get wrapped up very soon. And there were, to be honest, Frank, there were many items, there were many deliverables, small deliverables that came out of Busan whether it's fentanyl or whether it was on agricultural tariff liberalization and on suspending the affiliates rule, and all of those got done literally within a week. So I think the direction in which they're moving is an obviously a positive one.
To you, Mr. Zhao, about the U.S.-China phone call on the economic and trade issue. What do you think, reading from the Chinese readout, can be the priority?
Both sides agreed upon that this latest progress is welcomed by both sides. And I think definitely next year the agenda has been set. And because of that, two sides will try to maintain on good terms and will continue to make progress on this agreement. But I agree with Dr. Gupta, but on top of the issue that he mentioned, the rare earth issue, there's also soybean purchase, agricultural purchase issue, and also the fentanyl issue. Well, both are very sensitive U.S. domestic issues that Trump is focused on. There are recent progress, like the FBI heads has visited China, and also there's mill-to-mill conversation happening in Hawaii. So there are progress has been made. China concerned about three major things. One is continue lowering tariff to a reasonable level, and we're also focused on the Supreme Court judgment, whether they will cancel that on a wrongful legal basis. And secondly, China also cares about export control because when the U.S. side asking for release of rare earth, China also asking for the U.S. to lower its export bans. And thirdly, China also concerned about U.S. restriction on Chinese investment in the United States. Even though Trump himself wanted more Chinese investment in the U.S., however, there are many political obstacles to expanding China's investment to a even return to the 2017, 2018 level. So I think in order to make that progress next year, before the visit, two sides need to have more conversation on how to make progress to the satisfaction of both sides, and particularly on Chinese terms.
Professor Mahoney, also your thoughts on that. We've seen so many public discussions about how much the U.S. Is having its role in having its goals in mind in the negotiation with China. But what about China's priorities? How much are they being addressed so far?
I think, unfortunately, and not to be too one-dimensional in my discussion here, but I think that, any time the Taiwan issue gets touched, it becomes the central focus. It starts to overwhelm every other need. And as Professor Zhao noted, that's the fundamental red line. But then there are also the issues of U.S. export controls, which are older than the rare earth export controls from the Chinese side. And certainly, we know that Chinese investors, but not just that, many other Chinese aspects have faced various forms of discrimination and exclusion in terms of opportunities in the United States. So these are all significant concerns. But the moment Taiwan comes into the picture, it sort of pushes everything else out of the boat. And certainly, I think that this is something that we have to be concerned about as a general strategy, which is, will the United States effectively use Taiwan as a way to swamp all the other issues out of the way, and then relax pressure on that so that Trump can win the trade war that way.
Were others using that card of Taiwan try to spoil the whole picture?
There are certainly a lot of actors out there who want to spoil progress between the United States and China, and certainly want to press their own narrow agendas, whether they're geopolitical or regional.
Mr. Gupta, about the coming year, 2026, certainly there's going to be a visit in April. It seems that this phone call and its readouts from both sides confirmed that by the U.S. president to China. And meanwhile, Chinese president's visit to the United States. So how do you see the two sides can smartly use this timeline and make sure some of the priorities on both sides are being addressed so that there can be peace, stability, and prosperity?
At least for the April summit coming up, the focus, at least on the U.S. side, will primarily be on the commercial and trade aspect. Of course, other issues like Taiwan and also should be brought in so that there is language which affords stability. But I think that is going to be the primary focus And I think also the way to take things forward is to heed the message, the implicit message that has come out from China over the last 6 to 8 months with regard to Mr. Trump and the new administration. One, of course, being that China doesn't want the trade war, but it is ready to fight the trade war, and it will fight fiercely. But the more important trade-off which China has suggested implicitly to the U.S. administration is, please hold off on any major significant export control and tech denial-related activity vis-a-vis China, and we will be ready to open our markets to have greater trade deepening and integration between the two, which will substantially help reduce the trade deficit, which is Trump's priority, and will allow him and his ranchers and farmers and other core members of his political constituency to sell a huge amount of goods to China. So I think the reason the relationship has been stable in these last few weeks has been because it has been internalized through their repeated interactions from across their meetings in wherever, London, Geneva, Stockholm, Madrid, Kuala Lumpur, that there is an implicit bargain here between export controls and on trade opening. And I think the Americans have more or less gotten that. And therefore, the goal right now is to see that there's no backsliding on export controls by the U.S., and then framing out areas where China can realistically offer significant market access to help reduce that trade deficit.
All right.
I think once done, that can be the basis of a much more broader conversation later in the year on peace and stability and coexistence in the U.S.-China relationship.
Mr. Zhao, your thoughts? How both sides can smartly use this timeline?
Yeah, I also think that the ballast of the bilateral relationship will continue to be trade and economic relationships. So how to stabilize and try to maintain, and particularly to have clear rules of the road is very important for next year. So I hope next year when Trump visits China and President Xi visits the United States, both sides will confirm to lower tariff, to maintain a clear rule of the game on export control, shrinking the export control pool, and also try to increase bilateral investment activity, and also have a clear rule in terms of how Chinese companies will go publicly listed in the U.S. market, and how the U.S. can take advantage of the Chinese market moving forward. So if this could be done, and particularly if Trump is interested in this, hopefully the bilateral economic relationship will stabilize, and then two sides can move on to cooperate on more global governance issues and common challenges we face together.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for being with us.